Hello and welcome to this month's edition of Slugger TV. In this episode we're going to be looking at the prospect of an early Assembly election and is it time to leave the current devolved institutions behind us after yet another collapse. And to go through this topic we have Chris Donnelly, who is a columnist in the Irish News, and we have our very own Alan Mabin. You're both very welcome to the programme. Alan, I'm going to start off with you. First topic, the election that we may have, it may be in December, it may be in January, we may not have it at all. The Secretary of State as of yet hasn't specifically spelled out what way that will go. What have you made of the past 7 days in politics?
I think the last week or two in politics has been very disappointing. I suspect that the viewers are much more intelligent about whether there is an election or not than we are. As we speak, there isn't one yet, and we're in this kind of stasis period of there should have been one, but there isn't yet. I think I'm disappointed because out of the chaos of the Truss government, she gave Northern Ireland what seemed at the time nearly a gift of two unlikely, a Secretary of State and a Minister of State, who in many ways we shouldn't have particularly liked. They came with certain baggage. But the one thing that they had, both of them, I mean, Chris Heaton-Harris appeared to be very straight talking. He appeared to say what he meant, and it looked like he would then deliver on what he meant. And he effectively seemed to be resetting the relationship with the DUP. The Tories and the DUP have this kind of relationship where the Tories let down the DUP, and then the DUP go along and ask for money or ask for something kind of quite difficult, and eventually get it by going right up to the wire and then a wee bit further. So what happened this time? He kind of just played them at their game. They said, we're not going back without the protocol changed. He said, we're going to have an election. They said, we're really not going to go back. And he said, we're really going to have an election. And we got to kind of 5 past midnight or 1 minute past midnight. And I think probably a lot of us were sitting up waiting for the tweet to come out. There might not have been a town crier with a bugle, but we were expecting something to say, I've moved the writ, or I've asked for the election to be called, it'll be the 15th of December. And there was just silence. And then the next day there was a bit of pandemonium as he kind of said nothing, and then he postponed press conferences. Then he gave a press conference on the street, but pretended that you could embargo that, and effectively said, I'm not going to have the election yet, but we are going to have an election, and I'm going to have talks with the parties in a few days' time, but what will that change? So in a sense, I've been kind of let down, because I kind of grew to have a grudging respect for a Secretary of State who finally looked like they could kind of be different and not be as flimsy as some of them have been.
Fleeting.
But we got a couple of weeks, we got maybe kind of a month out of him, and then actually the first hurdle, the first time he had something, a new decade, new approach, that he could actually say, you might not have signed up to it, but he's kind of agreed that it was going to happen, and he hasn't actually
put it through. And let's not forget, after it was certain he was staying in, but it's hard to believe this time last week, we weren't even sure he was going to be Secretary of State.
Yes.
But once he stayed, he was confirmed he was staying in post. He was offered another chance then by people in the media when he was asked about, is this deadline going to move now? And he explicitly ruled out. He explicitly said, I will call an election on Friday.
And I'm sure we can talk about whether an election would be a good thing or not in a minute. But it just felt like he said he was going to do it. Clearly the Electoral Office had kind of done all the homework. They had count centres booked. Everything's kind of ready to go. And then he kind of delayed for no apparent reason, if he'd had a good reason, but actually he gave no reason other than, I'll tell you later.
Yeah.
And that's not a good cliffhanger.
Chris, what do you think of?
If he gets away with it, it's only because there's such little respect for this outposting that, to, in a sense, humiliate himself that way. I mean, there was probably when he first said we're going to have election, people thought, right, that's not happening. They're going to change the legislation, they'll do the thing at the 11th hour. Get closer and closer. He was adamant, it's going to be election, and then maybe that last 48, 72 hours, we thought, it's now going to actually be an election. And since then, now he started to move away. At the moment, again, perhaps it'll change. Perhaps they're holding out for an announcement. Maybe there won't be a December election. Maybe they'll say there's going to be election February, March. Maybe he's hoping for some notion that there'll be a triggering of talks between the British government and EU that provides some type of safety. I can't see any of that. I just think that if he gets away with it, it's because nobody, certainly in Britain, is paying close enough attention to care about the fact that a government minister has humiliated themselves in this manner. It also shows, of course, more importantly, because pride isn't the big thing, the poker face being exposed isn't really that big of a deal. They really don't have, the British government, the Tories don't have much of an electoral mandate, if any at all, in Northern Ireland. It more shows us that the British government is out of ideas about what to do here. And I think we're also hearing that from Micheál Martin's contribution, was it the Financial Times, was it, that piece? And I thought that was interesting, the suggestion that really we need to now get serious about looking at a different way of doing things here. I think that's, again, a confirmation that really at that government level, they don't see any future in what we're doing at the moment. Like most people here, I think, see at the moment, this place is just going to tot along, and along months you start racking up the years. And I know we had a bit of a chat off air about how much time in the devolution era has been spent when the institutions have been suspended, and there's maybe not a certain figure, but it certainly seems to be in and around 2/5 of the time since the agreement, since the institutions were set up, they haven't been running. And the fact that next year we're celebrating 25 years since the agreement, something which we should celebrate, 25 years since really peace became more embedded. And I know terrible things happened in 1998 and for a few years after, but it is the case, I know it's cliche, that life is so much better now for my kids. You know, my children are in their mid to late teens now, and you shudder to think, even as a parent, I can't think of what it would have been like for my parents sending me out with what was happening. So things have changed in that sense, but I think a lot of people are impatient for better now. They're impatient for more, and I think Micheál Martin, what he's saying, he's not the only one to say that. There's other voices saying that, and I think that's where the traction's going to be in the time ahead, to say, right, we need to look at things again.
So before we leap on to that conversation, just in terms of actually the election itself, I mean, people are talking about, oh, what would an election change, what would happen, but then, you know, I looked back at the kind of commentary in January 2017 as that election was launched, and the same narrative was out there. We had just voted 6 months before. Sure, the Assembly would be smaller, but Alan, if I told you in the middle of January, Unionism will lose its majority in 6 weeks' time, that was certainly not what was projected, and yet we had a very historic result. So is it not maybe worth going back after this paralysis and looking again, or would that just backfire?
So if you go back and have a very sad kind of Friday evening or whatever and look at old Slugger TV episodes, you will hear me sitting in one of these chairs saying that, you know, if the 6 months time's out, have the election, 6 months later have another election, bore the parties into change. I might contradict myself just now and go, in a sense that does seem fruitless, because we have one single party that effectively is holding a veto on the whole process, because the DUP are saying until the protocol gets sorted, and we know that's not going to be a fast thing. We know there are technical conversations going on in the background, but that's going to take months. It's going to take fewer months than it was going to take about a year ago, because actually people are now at least talking. And the Tories are rather desperate probably to get it sorted, and so they may actually cave in for something that is what Northern Ireland people might say was a bit substandard, and that's going to cause the DUP a bit of a problem again, because they may get a protocol change that they still don't like, and dear knows where we are at that point. So I'm not sure the election changes much. I was kind of looking at some of the I suppose some of the stability of the seats that the parties have. So if you take kind of Sinn Féin, they get a lot of kind of about 2/5 of their candidates get in at the very top of the poll, kind of in first, second. In fact, more than half of them get in first or second. So that they're very, very stable. Only 2 of their candidates got in a 5th in a seat. So in a sense, if you get a bit of a shift, it's not really going to affect them more than about 2 people. And in fact, they might actually sneak some of the ones off the SDLP or somewhere else that actually they could actually get that. The DUP are much more vulnerable. They have 5 candidates who were there elected last, you know, and very few of theirs actually get elected at the very beginning, just due to the way that their constituencies they're spread out across Northern Ireland. Sinn Féin are a bit more kind of concentrated in certain areas. So actually, Sinn Féin have nothing to lose from having an election really, other than the cost of getting wet and putting posters up. The other parties, I would say, UUP and the SDLP, are in diffs, because they're very vulnerable. The UUP ran nearly twice as many candidates as they actually got in. That's very expensive in terms of manpower. Where do they, you know, there's not going to be any room for growth accidentally, because they're going to have to cut back. People aren't going to want to go out. The SDLP are the same. Alliance, yeah, I mean, 7 of their candidates came in at the very last minute. But actually, if they could keep half of those, they're still doing way better than UUP or SDLP. So in a sense, nothing changes with this election other than we kind of disappoint the electorate because essentially we do democracy, we go and vote, and nothing really changes. Other than we get this confirmation or some kind of referendum that says, if you want to wait for the protocol, vote DUP. If you want to kind of get government going despite the protocol, vote everybody else. I'm not sure what we actually achieved by having an election. But part of me was okay with the Secretary of State saying, if I'm going to, if we meet the deadline, do it, I would be okay with that. But at the moment, I'm kind of in that disappointment land of going, he neither did that, nor does he have a good reason to delay it or to have it. It's in the worst of both worlds.
Chris?
I suppose I'd say two things about that. Having an election, but this wouldn't be the only jurisdiction where if you don't form a government, if things collapse, you go to election. It's other places have had serial elections, and that's probably, that's almost the norm because you are consulting the electorate. I know the fear here has always been, well, there's not going to be much change, but I think there could have been, and I suppose the timing of the election would be important because I do think this is going to be a very difficult winter for a lot of people. It's already very dreary out there. A lot of people find it quite tight. And you know how our narrative can develop. We've certainly seen it. I mean, David, you alluded at the start of the programme now, if we were sitting here a number of years ago, would we really have thought unionism would have lost its majority? We would really have thought the growth of the third bloc, the alliance, to the extent that they are. And I think that the EP have put a bit of a brave face, bit of bravado over the last number of weeks. I don't think they want an election. I really don't. I think, yes, while there has been talk, and I can understand it's natural to say that strategically some of that TUV vote might have come home if you have an election to the DUP. Not entirely certain that'd be the case because it's not like the discussions are not going to continue to be abound about the fact that whatever happens between the British government and the EU, even Michael Gove is still saying on Sunday, Sophie Ridge on Sunday this week, that the protocol is here to stay. It's just going to be changed in some way. So Jim Allister's still going to have that line saying these guys are going to end up having to swallow too much, and I'm the only person you could trust. That's not going to go away. And if the DUP continue to beat that drum and stay on that terrain, then there's going to be enough people within unionism will say, well, we got to stay to a harder position. I think the real fear for unionism is that even if the DUP grew a little bit, and even if they won 1 or 2 seats, it's going to be the case that they would have a bigger slice of an ever-diminishing pie. And that has been the story of unionism for years now. And it has been precisely because of the politics that we're seeing the DUP playing at the moment. And that's why I think the DUP, some would be shrewd enough to say that things could happen over the next few months around energy prices, around power cuts, and around maybe the health. I mean, our health service is in a desperate state. I know someone working within education, we're at the point of industrial action for teachers. I can't see that ending anytime soon. That'll probably get ratcheted up in the same way now Unison are balloting in terms of their health employees. So I think there truly is a bit of a winter of discontent looming. And in that context, the narrative about the DUP being the only party that's holding out could become something that they have right to be nervous about.
There are ways of fixing this in some ways. I mean, legislation could go through that says a speaker can be elected under a different guise, just to allow the Assembly to meet, to have more debate around issues. That might be a healthy thing, given that we have no ministers, we have, we don't even have shadow ministers, we just have nobody. So I think there are certain things that the Secretary of State could do that would be way outside the playbook of what normal looks like, but Northern Ireland, we're used to kind of small tinkering steps. So he might not actually delay the election, but he could actually at least let people talk. I think that would be healthy, because I think with a bit of a vacuum at the moment, I think the whole conversation around joint authority has basically, it's kind of come out of nowhere in my mind. I didn't see it coming, and it's not coming from either government. It's coming from nationalist parties, or seem to be the ones who are talking it up.
Back on that as well.
And they are rolling back on it, but it came out of that dangerous vacuum of nothing's happening, we'll throw some campaigny ideas that might get us some votes in, and then suddenly, I don't want to say it backfires, because it's not, it's a perfectly rational demand that people should make. you either like the idea or you don't understand it. But it has provoked a reaction that actually the reaction should have been, you're talking nonsense, there's no room for it, and this isn't the moment to bring it up. That would have been a decent reaction to it. But instead we now have all kinds of groups coming out. It's taking unionists' brain power up, and actually they're not holding the DUP to account for the fact that they're kind of vetoing government, and instead they're talking about all kinds of other things that don't really matter. That's suiting the joint authority conversation suits the DUP, I think, at the moment. It takes the heat off them now, but I don't think it's given them much space to actually come up with a new plan, because they can't have one. They have backed themselves into the wall. Though I kind of suspect, Chris, you may have other nuances on some of that.
Well, I think in terms of the joint authority discussion, I noticed, and again, I was on Nolan last week about this. It seemed to be a conversation unionism was getting itself in a tizzy over. It was very, very short. The period of time, I think the newsletter might have been counting the minutes between somebody mentioned joint authority and the British government releasing a statement saying that's not going to happen. I never thought it was going to happen, quite simply because it's not in the Good Friday Agreement.
Do you not understand though the anxiety, the fact that it took them, I think nearly 48 hours, was it that, you know, for a simple question, do you not think it took that long to rule it out? Can you understand why, if you're coming at it from the newsletter's perspective, for example, why they would have some anxiety about that?
No, and I'll tell you why. Because we don't have a conversation about the anxiety that nationalists have about the fact that the British government have yet to come out with a statement saying we're not going to have direct rule because that's not consistent with the Good Friday Agreement. We're going to continue to have some form of joint stewardship or some form of Irish government input, consultative role. That hasn't really been thrashed out by the British government over the last number of days, but I didn't get myself in a tizzy, and I didn't see nationalist parties, and I didn't see coalition group for dissident paramilitaries releasing statements and people on threatening dire consequences, and nor should I have, because if they did do that, they should be condemned for doing that, for being allowed to occupy our political mainstream and threaten to go back to violence. So I don't go along with that whole narrative, and I think that, you know, I think if there was a period of time where the British government said nothing, it's because you know, that was the poker moment for Chris Heaton-Harris. That was still, you know, he had thought he was coming here and he was going to play hardball and get an election called, and he thought that if he threw that threat on the table, that people might accede to his demand, and I think that when he was starting to realise it's not going to work, they obviously just said, well, hold off at the moment about this, you know. But it was a very short period of time.
Before I move on, do you think we will actually get an election at some point? So, I mean, just this was the self-imposed deadline. Under the current legislation, he has more time before he can call one, before he has to call one. Alan, what do you think? Do you think we could see one maybe in early 2023, in January, or do you think that this is just that the reporting that was done over the weekend from people like Vincent Kearney said the Secretary of State was overruled? Do you think that that's going to be the way it's going to go?
I think I and possibly Chris are going to look really stupid on TV at some point when this is broadcast, because something else could have happened. I think we probably will have an election before too long. I think Chris nearly confirms in my head that it's worth having one, because it is the normal thing to do, and to pot with the implications of that on smaller parties. I kind of like having Northern Ireland, I think, succeeds when it has a variety of smaller parties. Funny enough, now we're saying that the UUP and the SDLP are two of the smaller parties. We used to mean kind of the PUP and People Before Profit and things like that, but we're kind of we have to make do with what we have. So I think it would be a decent thing to do. I'm not convinced that he has been overruled. I think he's just getting lots and lots of different advice, and his head's probably a bit melted, and he's probably just trying to juggle things around. But I just come back to the fact that you should not march everybody up to the hill and be seen as it's basically bad parenting. So if a child comes and says, if bedtime is at 9 o'clock and they say, can I stay up to 9? Can I stay up to 10? And you kind of say no, and they say 9:45, and I kind of go 9:45. It's just come back, you kind of play hardball. He was very good parenting skills, playing very hardball. You knew where you stood, and you were thinking kind of as a member of the public and a voter, you're thinking he's not going to be kind of wound up by these parties the same as other people have, who kind of either have them round their finger or have them spinning around, not quite sure which way he's facing. He sounds like a man who's going to be Thran and just like go for it. And that's now, it's very difficult to get my trust back, never mind the rest of 1.8 million of us or whatever, because we're kind of in this place now going, Secretary of State's not a decent parent. He wouldn't make a good head teacher, would he?
I don't know who the super grand figure is going to be to come re-establish authority for the guy here. But no, look, if this is about him just realising, hold on, I need to buy myself time here. Why am I racing? Anyway, things aren't going to be changing here. But I do, if he was looking at it politically, in a politically, I think, an acute way and say, who was I trying to leverage a degree of pressure on? It was the DUP. Even though he's a member of the Tory government, he would know that the winter could be harsh for people. And in that context, and even looking what happened here, we thought when it came to the Westminster election in 2019, we didn't really see the DUP and Sinn Féin getting the hit that they did take. And of course, I remember being on this programme with yourself after saying it was very close to a disastrous election for Sinn Féin. Very, very close. And of course,
North Belfast masked a bad result.
Really did. And within weeks, both the parties went on board. So I think, and sometimes I think we underestimate the currents of change in this society. And that's why I think that it's probably the right call. And I don't like to see £6.5 million wasted on election. I'm not saying that, but I think in terms of the democratic responsibility and having a degree of trust and faith in people, and if Chris Heaton-Harris was looking here, he might say, look, maybe buy a bit more time, don't send people in December, but by all means let it be known that if we don't see progress soon, he's going to call it for late January, February. It's still going to be the same conditions of a harsh enough winter. Yeah.
Effectively, the departments can't really go on to the end of financial year and into the next one without a budget, because that will hit us just in the ability to spend, not just even spending on healthcare, which would be of big concern at the moment, but also spending on light bulbs for streetlights and things. There's a whole set of things, and there are jobs behind those as well, of contracts that can't be
And the other
held.
thing is that you're going to have a Westminster government that will be cutting likely the block grants to all the devolved regions and having civil servants trying to administer that, which is unprecedented.
And we have a set of money that we haven't been able to spend yet, which they're going to have to hopefully allow us to kind of carry over, though the Treasury don't like carrying across into the next year because that causes problems. But we haven't even been in the position to choose how to spend some of the money that we've got extra through all of that. So we're in a kind of a bad place, and an ungoverned Northern Ireland is a place that is terribly unstable. It means that you do get statements like the LCC. It does mean you get weird political conversations about things that are quite settled and don't need to kind of be raised. And it means that things like nurses' strikes don't actually get as much publicity and as much impact in terms of people's psyche as going, this is really bad that they're... the nurses' strike got us back the last time nearly. It's not going to this time.
And
it's going to be something much bigger.
The doubt this morning now over the £400 payment on bills being delivered in November, apparently that's not nailed down and not certain either, so we could be a bit later, we'll get it, but it could be January or it could be February maybe before anyone sees it.
There are stories that aren't even being reported. And I would know within education, families who should have their children entitled to free school meals, the Education Authority has been running at a terrible deficit. So there are a large percentage of children who have not got that notification, so therefore their families have been having to pay. That doesn't happen in a normal year. So there are pressures within the system, and I've already alluded to the fact that you've teachers now, industrial action, you have across the healthcare service. So you could see difficulties looming. Quite apart from all the other things that are going to be happening. So I do think in that context, there could be a sense that there could be an unknown factors, a variable thrown into an election in more likely, I'd say, early 2023 than December 22 at this time. That could mean that the political parties have a degree of fear maybe to look, and we know what happened that 2019 time. It meant that things had to be right outside, of course, in terms of Secretary of State, the British Irish government level. They had to have something ready to put down, and if you recall, really the DUP and Sinn Féin, they were bounced into that one. And I think whereas this time, it really, because those different issues like the Irish legislation, they've gone through now, it really is the DUP. The DUP are standing alone, and that's the difficulty.
So this, and Chris, you were talking about this at the top of the programme. I was just reflecting back the other night, all the agreements that we've had since the Good Friday Agreement that literally have either fallen at their first hurdle or are falling. I'm thinking about Fresh Start, Stormont House Now, New Decade, New Approach as well. every time we seem to rejig the 1998 settlement, it doesn't seem to last. Alan and Micheál Martin, the Taoiseach, was speculating on this in the Financial Times. It's been talked about among some of the other parties. Now with the rise of the Alliance Party and that United Community designation, is it now time to look at, now as we approach 25 years, is it now time to just junk the 1998 governmental arrangements? Obviously keep the spirit of, you're not going to do away with cross-community protections, but look at different ways of implementing kind of the spirit of that agreement. Is it time?
I think junk is probably too strong a term. I think it is definitely time that it needs amended. Because I think when we're actually up and running, it runs relatively well, given that we're a place that's still kind of in conflict, at least even with ideas and ideologies. So it does give us a certain sense of stability. It slows us down. It creates very interesting kind of relationships within government, and that is also kind of a good. So actually, when we have two big parties who ideologically don't like each other but can work together, they kind of come to a compromise and push a lot of things through, and we get more done than we get at the moment, which is nothing happening. So there's a sense that actually, if we were to think this is going to take 2 or 3 generations to actually fix, it's probably too early to junk it. But it definitely needs change, because we're into weird consequences of the fact that, you know, Alliance could surge further and actually still couldn't actually have much say when it comes to certain decisions. That kind of doesn't really work. We need to get out of the way. The Justice post, we need to it would be one of the things we could grow up and say anybody can be Justice Minister because they're held to account by committee, by the rest of the Assembly, the Executive and the Court of Public Opinion, and possibly the Court of the Land if they kind of stretch too far. So there are various things that we could do to stop that. The only cunning plan I can think of that the Secretary of State has or is working up at the moment, while he's kind of in this kind of interim period between saying there's going to be an election and having one, is he going to announce a set of measures to say you either have an election and go back, or I will bring the following in? You know, and actually he's going to come up with a small portfolio, a basket of things that actually do a bit of reform? Or is he going to say to the parties, basically, you have 2 or 3 weeks to sit in a room together and convince me of what you can agree are legitimate changes that actually make this thing better for everyone, and then we have an election and you can go back or not go back, but actually I would like that agreed beforehand. I mean, I think there's quite a lot of things that could be kind of tinkered with a little bit and it wouldn't be the end of the world. But I do get the feeling that it needs to happen sooner rather than later. I don't see why this should be the moment to do it, but I do wonder, just in the back of my head, I kind of wonder, he's going to have to bring something grand out of the cupboard if he doesn't want to look weak. Is it that actually there's some kind of process for changing it?
I don't know if it's going to come from a British Secretary of State. Firstly, to do I just don't know if that's where it'll come from. If it does, it's quite simply because he's lumped with the burden of saying, what are you going to do to try to trigger change and some type of developments in this in the society. I think the big changing factor that it is going to propel this, obviously, is the growth of the third bloc, the Alliance Party, and it is, of course, entirely plausible that you could have a point the next election cycle, the one after, where the Alliance Party pips one of the other two parties, and then it becomes a sense of, well, why are we continuing with the structure that essentially, in a way, disenfranchises that bloc? It's also the logical outworking of an acceptance within the more rational strand of unionism and within mainstream nationalism now, that the only way to resolve the constitutional discussion and to one's preference or the other is through that persuasion, and that bloc there represents the prize for either. And with, coupled with demographic changes, I can't see how, of course, things fluctuate, but it's not going to go away. No. That third bloc, and maybe the ideas that emanate from within that third bloc are going to be like everything else. The other political parties are going to start poaching some of their ideas because they're going to realize we need to do this. And I think from there is where you see, it's like Stephen Ferry today was very quick to praise Micheál Martin's contribution. I think many people will look at maybe the success of Belfast City Council, where you have a rainbow of political parties in the council, and of course you still have, and I know David Heath never misses the meeting. It's like Christmas comes once a month with this man who Belfast City Council leads. But the point is that
they've got the call-in mechanism. They don't have petition concern.
They do, but things get done at least. Decisions get taken, and of course they have discussions and arguments. But the arithmetic within the council is such that it doesn't allow maybe an obstructionist party to veto things in a way.
Can't be too extreme.
No,
all of the time.
Because of the different ways that you can make up a majority.
Yeah.
In a weird way, it forces the DUP and Sinn Féin together on big issues. You'd be surprised how many times because they have to come together if they want to get something done. The two of them quite often have to come because they can get a majority
and
that
they
way.
will agree in advance. It's very this is very mature politics. That stuff gets done in the back room and then come as to say, well, 2/3 of us already believe this. Will the rest of you come on board? I mean, that's normal. And since that's what Northern Ireland politics has to get to. But we're kind of in this place at the moment, strangely, that one party can put the handbrake on. And that's over something that they could still not like, but be in government. So they're holding up Northern Ireland government, asking for the UK government to do something else. And that's kind of, that's an abuse of power in my mind.
I think we're almost waiting for that moment to drop where that political party, the DUP, realising that approach, that veto approach, that naysaying approach, is ultimately the most destructive thing that they could do for the attainment of their ultimate political objective. And you're waiting on that, because if and when that happens and a different approach comes, well, then it'll make these, one would think it would potentially make these different approaches to government and re-establishing the institutions, making the institutions work, something that would become much more effective.
But the only way for them to learn that lesson is probably at the polls with half the DUP vote going somewhere else. And you've got to question, would it go to the TV, would it go to the UUP, would it go to the Alliance? Those are about the only three places it could go. And you kind of go, I don't really see very much of it going.
Yeah.
So I don't think they're going to get that at the doors. Now, maybe if you have an election, they will. And maybe that's why you throw it out to the electorate, because the electorate can be quite surprising. And sometimes there are undercurrents that we don't see and that polls don't pick up. But I would be still surprised if we came back and the five parties weren't in the same order and pretty much the same kind of trend of how you step down between their votes. There's not much being changed, and that leaves a very depressing programme for us here, because what is going to change in the new year, what's going to change later to make all this different?
The only thing I'd say about that is I don't see the DUP vote being detrimentally impacted. That's not to say the pro-union vote won't be, and that's the realisation, I think, that we're waiting on the DUP, recognising that yes, they might maintain or even increase their slice of the pie, but the problem for them is that pie is getting smaller. You know, the Alliance having MPs in North Down, Alliance in the past having MPs in East Belfast, Alliance threatening the DUP in a heartland like Lagan Valley. This isn't a natural order of things for them, and it only happens because enough people who once were even small u pro-union have become utterly disillusioned with the DUP-led brand of unionism. And that's the realisation that at some point will have to come. And it makes it even more difficult, I think you're right, Alan, when the DUP are able to turn and say, hold on, we're still getting our 27, 28 seats. It's impacting the other guys around us on the red, white and blue benches. But the problem is that those benches are getting less populated.
Yeah.
You know, and that's the difficulty.
Okay, well, thank you very much for going through such broad topics. We unpacked a lot there. I know we'll be back surely talking about this before maybe the next Assembly election, maybe December, maybe January, maybe not at all, who knows. And that just leaves me just to say thank you very much to my guests, Chris Donnelly and Alan Mabin, and also thank you to you for watching. You can keep up to date with everything in the meantime on sluggerotoole.com.